We might as well get started. Just like to welcome you all here for yet another exciting seminar by Boxar, assisted by Heather Nancarrow. I might just cut to the chase, the really important part of this. Put your hand up if you haven't registered for our conference. Go on. We know who you are. If you haven't, you're missing, as I say here, the most exciting, stimulating and challenging event of the year. This is where we get the best and brightest from around the country to talk about research they've done that's immediately relevant for policy. It's only 2 weeks away. You really don't want to miss out, so I'd urge you to just hop on the line to boxar.gov.au, and the rest is going to be perfectly straightforward. A couple of things. I'd like to, first of all, acknowledge I'll just go back. I can work out how to do it. It doesn't seem to want to happen. F.D. Stavro is the lead researcher on this project, and Suzanne Poynton and myself and others. But FD really would have liked to have been able to present this talk to you, but she's off visiting her niece in Queensland, I think it is, so she wasn't able to be here. So she's the one that did all the analysis. If you've got complicated questions about the stats, I'll just sit down and you can take some time out. I'll try my best to actually answer them. We're also privileged to have here, as a commentator on our paper, Dr. Heather Nancarrow, who's CEO of ANROS, which is the National Women's Safety Research Organisation. Heather, for those of you who don't know, has held many positions in the field of women's safety. She's the Foundation Director in the Queensland Centre of Domestic and Family Violence Research. She's worked in various roles in women's shelters and is coordinator of the community education at Queensland-wide Domestic Violence Resource Centre. But after 10 years of community work, she moved into the Women's Policy Unit at the Office of Cabinet in Queensland, where she was involved in the development and implementation of the Queensland Government policy Stop Violence Against Women, which was launched back in 1992. She's received a number of awards, including the Queenslander of the Year Community Spirit Award. But the reason I asked her to make a commentary on the work that we've done, and the thing that stands out to me most about Heather and the work, is that she's one of those rare people that combines academic rigour with frontline experience and a real understanding of the way in which research can inform policy. So it's delightful to have her here. I'm not sure where she's... Hello, Heather. We should all like to welcome Heather Nancarrow. So the way this is going to work is that I'm going to give you a brief run through the research in case you haven't seen it. Then Heather's going to do a commentary. And then what we'd really like is to get some discussion going from you on the floor. So gather up your questions as you go, and we'll get straight into it. Most of you would know that about 1 in 4 women in Australia experience intimate partner violence since the age of 15, and by violence I mean not just assault but also threats of violence and sexual assault. This violence has serious physical and psychosocial consequences. We found that out in a study that we did a few years ago using HILDA, the Household Income and Labour Dynamics Survey, where we looked at a large cohort of women who'd experienced violence, followed them up over time, and found that there were significant effects on mental health after violence. We didn't, just in case you think that happens with every crime, we didn't find any effect for property crime. We only found effects for violent crime. Past research in this area has looked at various predictors, including youth, of course, abuse as a child, sole parent status, social isolation, alcohol abuse, controlling behaviour on the part of the partner, and financial stress. And there is some overlap with associations in general violence. For example, in violence generally, you find a strong association with personal and financial stress and lack of physical and emotional support. But there are some limitations in past research. Most studies don't distinguish between intimate partner violence and domestic violence generally. That's unfortunate because there are significant differences in different forms of violence. The dynamics of violence involving parents and children may well be quite different to that which involves intimate partners. Another issue is that most studies tend to examine, it's not so much most studies, but much of the discussion surrounding emotional abuse has been emotional abuse as an outcome rather than as a potential predictor of intimate partner violence. And the Australian research using representative national samples looking at factors predictive of reporting and help seeking is fairly limited. And that's partly because the Australian Bureau of Statistics surveys have had very good measures of victimisation, but quite poor measures of the covariates that might influence that. The Personal Safety Survey is a real step in the right direction as far as that's concerned. So the questions we were interested in were just 3. Who's most at risk of intimate partner violence? What factors influence the likelihood of victims reporting an intimate partner violence incident to police? and what factors affect the likelihood that someone will seek advice or support after an intimate partner violence incident. Am I talking too quickly for anybody?
Yeah.
Right. Guess who said that? My dear friend Jenna. All right, I'll slow down. Someone give me a drink or something. One really important thing is that this is a study of predictors and correlates. It's not a study of causes and effects. It's very important because as I work through some of the factors that have been found to be associated with intimate partner violence, there'll be a temptation for people to think I'm talking about its causes. The things I'm going to be talking about could be causes or consequences, or not even related except statistically. They are simply markers of who's most at risk of domestic violence, or who's most likely to report, or who's most likely to seek help. So there's our data source. It's the Australian Personal Safety Survey 2012, which, as I said, is a large nationally representative sample, which measures intimate partner violence, or interpersonal violence, I should say, experienced by both men and women since the age of 15. It involves standardised face-to-face, sensitively undertaken interviews. And what I mean by sensitively undertaken is that the interviews were conducted in a way which ensured the potential offender wasn't present. So there were no interviews where potential partner or somebody else who might be an assailant was nearby. That was to leave the respondent comfortable and able to respond honestly. Obviously, it contains questions on the relationship with the perpetrator-victim perception of the incident, which will turn out to be quite an interesting variable to look at, and whether the incident was reported to police or advice was sought. So there are 3 subsamples. The risk of victimisation stuff I'm going to present to you is based on 490 women who experienced intimate partner violence in the 2 years prior to the personal safety survey, and the other group were women who had never experienced any violence. So we're not comparing it to people who might have had some experience of non-domestic, non-intimate partner violence. We're comparing the intimate partner violence victims to people who didn't experience or haven't experienced any violence. Reporting to police is based on similar samples, 469 people whose most recent experience of assault, and I'm saying assault here to distinguish it from violence more generally, in the past 2 years was perpetrated by an intimate partner, and a somewhat larger sample for the help-seeking and support-seeking group, those whose most recent incident of violence, in that sample we include both threats and actual violence, was perpetrated by an intimate partner. We didn't look at male victims for no other reason than that the sample was too small for detailed analysis. That isn't to say there aren't men who are victims of intimate partner violence. There are. It's just that for our purposes, the group weren't big enough for analysis. So here is our dependent variables: whether the female respondent reported having been a victim of intimate partner violence, which includes physical or sexual assault or threat from an intimate partner. An intimate partner is a boyfriend, girlfriend, current partner, previous partner. I've already explained that we don't include people who had different forms of violence. The second one was whether it was reported to police, and the third one was whether advice or support was sought. So here are our independent variables. These are all the ones we looked at, not all the ones we included. Some deserve some comment. Let's see, this whether it can raise $2,000 in a week, late bill payment, late mortgage payment, and pawned or sold something for cash are standard measures of economic or financial stress that have been used in the general social survey and are included in this survey. Went without meals is another one of those. Ability to get support in a time of crisis from outside the household is our measure of social support, or if you like, social capital, the extent to which in times of stress somebody can get support from someone who's not part of the household. Ability to ask for small favours, again, taps this social capital issue. Childhood physical or sexual abuse, because we know that's a good marker for it. Emotional abuse, this time we've included it on what we like to call the right-hand side of the equation, so we're using the ABS measure of emotional abuse as a potential predictor of physical of violence. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. Type of perpetrator, gender of perpetrator, type of violence was physical versus sexual, whether there were drugs or alcohol involved, whether the incident was perceived as a crime or whether the victim was physically injured. So Here's a bit about emotional abuse for those who aren't familiar with the ABS measure of it. It includes a really long list of behaviours, which I've got here and can show you if you like. I'm not going to put them up right now, but they include things like whether you've been stopped or someone's tried to stop you from contacting family, friends or community, whether you've stopped or someone's tried to stop you from using the telephone, internet or family car, or whether they've monitored your whereabouts or tried to control who you saw or where you went, or tried to control money. So there's a whole bunch of controlling behaviours and similar sorts of behaviours in that emotional abuse. And we're interested in the question specifically of whether that's a strong predictor of violence. So the analysis, any statisticians in the audience? Well, I won't spend 5 hours on that. So we're basically doing bivariate tests with chi-square to find out which of that long list of factors are associated with intimate partner violence. Then we're taking the ones that are significant and throwing them all into multivariate logistic regression analysis to see which are predictors when you control for other factors. Will that suffice? You want more? The complicated bit that I wasn't so familiar with is that when you're looking at reporting and help seeking, you're talking about incidents as the unit of analysis, and a particular victim can have multiple incidents. That means that the errors in the equation can end up correlated. So lo and behold, you end up using generalised linear mixed model with random intercepts. I had no idea that that's what we did until I looked it up. But there you go. It's wonderful analysis for those of you who are concerned about such things. Now, just a word about odds ratios. What I'm going to report to you are odds ratios, which are often confused with risks. They're not risks. They basically give you an index of the likelihood, well, I wouldn't say the likelihood, the odds of someone becoming a victim of violence or of reporting or of seeking help against the odds of not. The thing you need to know is simply this, that if the odds ratio is more than 1, the person is more likely to be a victim or more likely to report or more likely to seek support. If the odds is less than 1, they're less likely to be a victim. So, for example, if the odds ratio is 6, that means the odds of some outcome is 6 times higher. If the odds ratio is 0.02, long way less than 1, then the odds are about 50 times less. I'll say a little bit more about the relationship between odds ratios and risks as we move along. So, here's what turned out to be significant after we threw all those variables into the bivariate analysis and then put them all into the multivariate. This is what turned out to be significant. So on the left-hand side there, you've got the age group of the victim. In the contrast section, we're showing you who we're comparing with whom. So in the top row there, we're comparing 50 to 59-year-olds with 18 to 19-year-olds. Next one down, we're comparing 60-year-olds to 18 to 19-year-olds. And if you look across at the AOR, the adjusted odds ratio, you'll see both of them are less than 1, which of course tells us that if you're 50 to 59, you're less likely to be a victim than an 18 to 19-year-old. And similarly for 60 plus, we didn't find any significant relationship between those who are older than 18, 19, but less than 50. No difference in the risk of victimisation, so it just drops off like that. We also found that if the highest level of education was a certificate, you are more likely to be a victim of intimate partner violence than if your highest level was year 10. I have no idea why that's true. That's maybe something we might like to talk about later. Interestingly, country of birth, if you were born in a non-English speaking country, you are less likely to be a victim of intimate partner violence than if you were born in Australia. If you have a disability or long-term health condition, more likely as the sole parent with children versus a couple, more likely if you can't get crisis support outside the family, and certainly more likely if you've had childhood abuse. But look at the odds ratio for emotional abuse. It's 19. In other words, the odds of being a victim of intimate partner violence are 19 times higher for someone who's experienced emotional abuse than for somebody who has not. And all the financial stress ones are also important. They increase the likelihood of becoming a victim of intimate partner violence. Jenna, am I still talking too quickly?
Oh, don't worry about me. I'm keeping up.
Okay, so I promised you I'd turn these obscure odds ratios into something more resembling risk, and this is it. If you want to know how you do this and you're really interested, I'll tell you later. But so the curious thing about logistic regression is that you can't say what the effect of one factor is without specifying the values of the other factors. That's the odd. It's not like ordinary least squares regression. So we have to start with a base case. This is our comparison group. The base case I'm starting with is Someone who's married with children aged 30 to 39, their highest level of education is a certificate, they're born in Australia, they've got no disability or long-term health condition, they have social support, they've had no child abuse, they've got no long-term health condition, no emotional abuse and no financial stress. So the bottom where it says base, the probability of that person having experienced intimate partner violence in the last 2 years is 0.1 or 10%. If that same person or that same group of people actually have no social support, it jumps to 34%. If in addition to lacking social support, they're experiencing emotional abuse, it jumps to 58%. And if they've got no social support, they're experiencing emotional abuse and they've got financial stress, it jumps to 91%. That's not to say there are a lot of people out there experiencing it, simply to say that your risk goes from quite low to quite high if you've got these sorts of characteristics. And I'll say a bit more about that later. So reporting, just a bit of background to it. First of all, a little bit over a quarter of those experiencing physical or sexual assaults were reported to police, or if you like to put it another way, around about 3/4 didn't report to police. The main reasons given by the respondents the victims for not reporting, most common one is that the woman felt she could deal with it herself. That accounts for about a third. The woman didn't regard the assault as serious. That accounts for about 1 in 5, 18%. 12%, more than 1 in 10, feared the perpetrator. 9% didn't want the person arrested. I think Heather might have something to say about that later. And 7% of the victim felt ashamed or embarrassed by the experience. So far as help seeking is concerned, where the most recent incident of violence was perpetrated by an intimate partner, in 69% of cases the victim sought some assistance, nearly always, or I said most commonly from a friend or family member, about a quarter from a counsellor or support worker, 23% from police, 21% from a GP. So GPs are sort of level pegging with police in terms of seeking support, and another health professional, 4%. The first person told is usually the family and friends, and a long way after that, police, GP and counsellor or support worker. So here's what turned out after we went through those factors I described to you one by one, testing for significance, and then put them into the logistic regression. This is what turned out to be significant. So you were less likely to report to police if you were a boyfriend, girlfriend, date, compared with someone who was a previous partner. You were less likely if it was a current partner, no surprises there, compared with a previous partner. Much more likely if you were a victim of physical assault compared with sexual violence, and certainly more likely if you're physically injured. Much less likely if you thought what had happened was wrong, but not a crime, compared with somebody who thought it was a crime. And certainly much less likely if you thought it's just something that happens, compared with someone who thought it was a crime. And if you couldn't raise 2,000 in an emergency, you're more willing to report, which is an interesting result. The help-seeking behaviour was a bit of disappointment from a purely research point of view because there were so few factors related to it, even at a bivariate level. And the only thing that seemed to matter was whether or not you were a boyfriend, girlfriend or date. You were in those circumstances less likely to seek help than if it was a previous partner. And you were far more likely to seek help if it was a current partner compared with a previous partner. More likely to seek help if it's physical violence compared with sexual, and all the other factors there were non-significant. So just summarising, you're less likely to be a victim of intimate partner violence if you're over the age of 50 or born in an overseas non-English speaking country. More likely to be a victim if your highest level of education is a certificate, or you have a long-term health condition, or you live in a one-parent household, unable to get support outside the family in a crisis, have experienced abuse as a child, or under some form of financial stress or emotional stress particularly. As far as reporting goes, you're more likely to report to police if you're physically injured, if it's physical rather than sexual violence, and if you're not able to raise $2,000 in an emergency. You're less likely to report if it's a current partner, no surprise there, and sadly less likely to report if you think it's wrong but not a crime or just something that happens. More likely to seek help if the intimate partner violence was a previous partner and so on. So what are the policy implications? Well, I'm not going to steal Heather's thunder. She's the policy expert, but I just want to highlight three things which have struck us as potentially important. The first is that support services need to focus more resources on households that are experiencing financial stress and women who are socially isolated. I acknowledge that some of the women who are experiencing financial stress are experiencing it because they've left the home as a consequence of the family violence, but I still think that it's something well worth considering and working out where to put resources and social support as well. It still troubles me that there are a large or significant number of people in the community who don't understand that it's a criminal crime to commit domestic or intimate partner violence. Maybe we need to do more. Maybe people will accept that but simply don't want to involve the criminal justice system. And the screening tools, which are becoming very popular at the moment, need to focus more closely on emotional abuse as a potential marker of physical and sexual violence. Now, I won't go into all that. I'm now going to get Heather to make policy sense of it all. Heather, if you would. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I will do my best to make policy sense for you. And I want to begin by acknowledging that we're on the land of the Gadigal people here, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of the Gadigal people, and their elders who are past, elders present, and also to future generations of Gadigal people. I also would like to pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present here today. I think for me this is really important to acknowledge Aboriginal people of this land. It's Aboriginal land, always was and always will be. And particularly in the context of... Oh, Jenna's going to wire me up.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much for that. Look, the reason it is protocol, but it's more than protocol for me, particularly because of the nature of the work that I've done with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly in Queensland, but more generally, and that when I talk about this topic, I'm very mindful that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do suffer a greater burden of the effects of violence against women than the general population. And some of those effects are a consequence, either directly or indirectly, of the colonisation of their lands. So that's not the focus of the topic today or the discussion today, but I did want to make that point, and it's important for me to remind myself and also to draw to your attention that we are on Aboriginal land and we have a responsibility to acknowledge that, but also to work towards repairing the harms that have been indirectly and directly caused by the impacts of taking their land and their culture. So I wanted to also congratulate Effie and Suzanne and Don on this piece of research, and particularly I think what's really interesting about this and important is, I think, to use existing data sets, as you have done, the PSS, to undertake further analysis to really explicate what we can learn from that rather than simply going collecting more data, because it does have an impact on people when we're asking about their experiences of violence. So I'm always encouraged when researchers do use data sets that are already existing rather than requiring further investigation when there's already material there to analyse. It's also important because it does really draw out some of the, I think, some of the pressing policy issues that confront our sector and confront governments about, we have got what now is being described as an epidemic of intimate partner violence in our country. We've been working on the issue for a very long time. Me personally for more than 35 years now, but there are people who've been working even longer on trying to address this issue than I have, and it feels like that at times that the problem's getting worse, not better. And I've got a number of thoughts about why it appears that way, and I don't think it's necessarily the case though. I suppose I just want to draw out some of the key points and respond to them as I saw them in the paper. And one of the things that you said, Don, in your presentation that I thought was worth drawing out, and when we talk about intimate partner violence, I think there's a sense that we have a shared understanding of what that means. And you made a point about emotional abuse. Sorry, I'll need my glasses for this. They'll be on and off a bit. Emotional abuse is a predictor of IPV rather than, we have seen it as part of intimate partner violence, and your research has found that it's a predictor of intimate partner violence. So that statement suggests to me that emotional abuse is a predictor of physical violence. Am I right in thinking about that? So it's correlated with it. So whereas we have argued for many years that emotional abuse is intimate partner violence, and so there's. It reminds me, or highlighted for me, I think, an important discussion that's been going on in the literature for some time, particularly in the US, but there's a guy called Evan Stark from the United States who wrote a book in 2007 called Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Relationships. And I think that, what his analysis, there's a whole debate about typologies of violence. And again, I can't go into great detail about the debate about the distinctions between situational couple violence and intimate partner terrorism and separation instigated violence and so on. But there is a body of literature out there, and there are attempts to try to delineate these different types of violence. So the main proponent of that is Johnson, but his work particularly is critiqued because of the problems of trying to fit people into several boxes. So is it intimate partner terrorism? Is it this and that? And he focuses on physical violence. Evan Stark said that's all wrong, and the reason that he says the Feminist Project in the United States has failed in terms of the criminal justice response because of a failure to separate out coercive control from fights. Now, what I really love about Evan Stark's work, and which I think can help us in terms of analysing the results of research like this and thinking about how do we respond more effectively to intimate partner violence, is to understand what is the crux of the problem. Evan Stark says coercive control is the problem. Coercive control is an attack on autonomy, liberty and equality. That's the offence, and it may or may not include actual physical violence. It's about, he doesn't use the word intimate partner terrorism, that's Johnson's terminology, but it's similar to that in that it's an attempt by a man who has a sense of entitlement to control in general the life of his female partner, and that removes autonomy and liberty and equality. So her personhood is denied. So that is the kind of problem that really, when the feminist community was trying to articulate a response to intimate partner violence back in the 70s and early 80s in Australia, we were really trying to unpack, and we talked a lot about power and control. It's about power and control. But I think Evan Stark captures it more neatly in talking about it's an attack on autonomy, liberty and equality. Now, the PSS has, it counts acts of physical violence and emotional abuse, but it counts acts, it can't sort of contextualise those acts. So we're not really getting behind, was it coercive control, or was it, a single incident? Was it a multiple series of, physical acts? So I think that for me, that's a key point about what is the problem when we talk about intimate partner violence? What do we really mean? What is the problem we're trying to address? Because if we're trying to address coercive control, this attack on autonomy, liberty and equality, the responses to that are going to be different to a response to an isolated one-off incident, which may explain why, and certainly women in the research in the PSS said that they thought they could manage it themselves. If it was the first and only time they've ever been hit, it wasn't in this broader context of them walking on eggshells and being afraid of their partner because he was denying them autonomy, liberty and equality, then they probably do feel and probably can manage that. So this might be one explanation about why they're not wanting to seek police help. What we really have to unpack more, and I think it's very difficult to if not impossible, to do it through large-scale population surveys like the PSS, but we need to better understand how to respond effectively to coercive control. So that would be, a major thing, I think, for us to consider about how is it that we do that. I think the findings about the elevated risk of intimate partner violence for women around the lack of support, experiencing emotional support and so on, which is the strongest correlation, and it goes back to my point there about, we would see that emotional abuse is is, in some definitions of intimate partner violence, and this is why I think it's important to realise that we don't always necessarily have a shared understanding of what we mean when we say intimate partner violence. But, whilst it's the strongest correlation, I would also say it in itself, even if there wasn't actual physical violence, if there's emotional abuse that's about coercive control, then that is intimate partner violence and needs may lead to, well, it's harmful in itself, but could also lead to homicide and, the more serious ends of physical violence. So, certainly we know from this research and from others, and you quote Anna Ferrant and her colleagues from about 1996, I think, that, I think was the first study in Australia to recognise that, yes, violence against women or intimate partner violence occurs across the spectrum of socioeconomic and, other diversity, but it's not spread equally, and we know that from various research. But it doesn't mean that we don't pay attention to where it's not as prominent or as prevalent, but it does help us understand where we need to direct resources and how we direct resources differently. So the cumulative, sorry, just let me... So the suggestion then in the research that these findings might suggest the potential need for a risk assessment tool to identify women at risk and to be directing resources to women who are, have financial stress, who are being emotionally abused, who don't have social support, women who are isolated. Absolutely, I would agree with that in terms of short term. But again, it reinforces long term. We need to deal with inequality in our society. We need to deal with gender inequality. We need to deal with economic inequality, particularly for women, but not only for women. And we need to deal with racial inequality. So I think that we need to look at the intersections of inequality and address them simultaneously. If we, in the long term, are going to have a society where men and women and people have a degree of an equal share in the social and economic benefits that a country like ours has to offer. So I think that's, an important long-term goal. I mean, we're not going to achieve that overnight, but yes, certainly look at supporting women who are isolated and under financial stress more directly in the short term. I would say, though, in developing a risk assessment tool to do that, to support that policy and service provision, that we need to avoid the potential to blame victims for their circumstances. So, because this is really focused then on the victim's circumstances and identifying the risk because of the victim's circumstances. And so we need to be careful then in doing that, that we're not holding her responsible for her situation, but we're also looking at, well, what are the circumstances of the perpetration of that violence? And some of that may be related to financial stress and so on. Is that about coercive control? Is it about something else? What is the right response to that particular scenario? What else? The other thing that I think a really important finding in this research is the health impacts, the short and long-term health impacts. So we do know from this research and others, and I might just here refer to some of the work of ANROS. So ANROS undertakes research in-house a bit, but more so we have a competitive grants process, and we've got a number of projects across the country that are being delivered by others. And one of the pieces of research that we commissioned was a burden of disease of intimate partner violence study that was conducted by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. We launched that research in October in Canberra last year with the Dr. Claudia Garcia Moreno, who's the World Health Organisation's expert on violence against women. She happened to be in the country at the time. And that research highlights that for women in childbearing years, so 18 to 44, intimate partner violence is the biggest single contributor to the burden of disease, and that it doesn't mean that it makes people sick more than anybody else. The burden of disease is a particular methodology that it calculates reduced health in so years of disability. It's mortality and then years of disability to calculate the daily adjusted years of life, so the daily. So it's a complicated methodology to measure if a disease, and in this case intimate partner violence is the disease, what contribution is that disease making to the overall burden burden of disease in a population? So first of all, you need a prevalence rate, and then you need to calculate the daily to figure out. So for women aged 18 to 44, intimate partner violence is the biggest single contributor. It's 5.1% of the burden of disease for women in general in the Australian population in that age group, but it's nearly 11% for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. So it's nearly 6 times greater, the rate in terms of contributing to the burden of disease for Indigenous women compared to women in the population in general. So that, and I should say that the impacts, the burden of disease, or the health impacts that account for most of that burden of disease are anxiety and depressive disorders, and homicide and suicide or self-harm inflicted as a consequence of intimate partner violence. So, this is really very significant, and, your research is reinforcing what the burden of disease study has shown, really highlights the importance of the health system. And I think we have traditionally looked to police and courts as a solution to violence against women. But there is an opportunity here for health practitioners to identify early on, as soon as possible, if they are seeing women presenting with anxiety or depressive disorders, then given the results of the burden of disease study and this research, they ought to be thinking, what's behind this? What are the circumstances at home? Is this woman are these symptoms of intimate partner violence? And so there's an opportunity there for early intervention, and obviously the earlier we can intervene in intimate partner violence, the less likely there are longer-term health consequences, as well as other social factors related to and economic factors related to continuing intimate partner violence. So the health professions have a really important role to play in identifying, responding early to signs of intimate partner violence, but they also have an important role to play in the long-term health consequences. So that even if women are out of the violent relationship, the cumulative effects on health of exposure to intimate partner violence for women and their children are long-term. And so we need to recognise that there needs to be long-term therapeutic intervention, and particularly targeted to the, to the context in which that, and again, it's about the coercive controlling nature of the violence. So that the coercive controlling nature of violence is the kind that leads to these kinds of disorders, I think, because it's the removal of personhood, of autonomy, of your sense of identity and who you are, and you become an extension of the perpetrator. These are things that are really critically important in thinking about how we intervene and how we can best support women. So I think I just want to keep re-emphasising this notion of coercive controlling violence is the insidious aspect of intimate partner violence, and that we really need to be mindful of that and its implications. The low rate of reporting to police, and Don said I might have something to say about that. I've said a little bit about it, I guess, that in that, so women have reported through the PSS that they thought that they could manage itself. It wasn't serious enough. They didn't want him arrested. Now, there's a whole range of complicated reasons why at an individual level women might make those choices. It might be that it was, she saw it as a minor incident and it was one-off, and, particularly in the PSS, which doesn't talk about the context of the violence. Or it might be that she is really afraid of him, and that was one of the other things that women reported about why they didn't report to police. They didn't want him arrested. Now, that becomes very complicated, and as Don said, or at least in the research, I'm not sure if you've said it in the presentation, but the PSS doesn't have a sample size sufficient to be able to do analysis for Indigenous women specifically. But I know from my research, and we know from other research on violence in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, that they have a more complicated relationship to the state than non-Indigenous women do. So whilst non-Indigenous women, including myself, for many years have advocated for a very strong state response and an equal response to any other, as I think is completely justifiable, that violence against women shouldn't be treated any less seriously than violence against anyone else. However, I think that we need to understand that a reluctance on the behalf of some women in our communities, and not only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, but some immigrant and refugee women, because of their relationship or their experiences of state intervention in their lives, it's a barrier for them. It's actually the state and police and courts represent a threat rather than a resource for them. And even more than that, some of our policy and service responses have been to, and again for good reason, advocating for reduced discretion by police and courts in the way that they manage these cases. And that's because of frustration with years and years of neglect of the issue and avoidance and a lack of taking serious, not taking serious the complaints of women to police and courts about their experiences of violence. So what we've done, and my most recent research has really looked at in the Queensland context what that's meant for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander in rural and remote areas, particularly the research sites being Mount Isa and Cairns, and that there's cities, regional cities that outreach to the Gulf of Carpentaria and Cape York Peninsula. So they're people who are living in remote, isolated areas of the state, but the response has evolved over time in Queensland that and is similar in other states and territories where there's a pro-arrest policy. So whilst we don't have, in the first instance, like the US, that there's a criminal response with a civil protection order response being the secondary response, we've got the reverse, where in general the protection orders, the civil protection order system is the initial response, and then criminal law is supposed to be used in conjunction with, but rarely is, as other researchers have shown. But in doing that, in reversing the onus, if you like, and saying, well, police shouldn't have discretion about that. If in fact, police in Queensland say, if in doubt, take it out. So if there's evidence of an act of domestic violence, so under a prescribed act in the legislation, so there's a list of things that if you do this, this is domestic violence, so under the definition, and if there's a relevant relationship, then that equals domestic violence. So there's no examination of, is it coercive control, is it, what is the impact and the context here, how does it manifest, and so on. If there's a prescribed action, a relevant relationship, that equals domestic violence. When the laws were developed, they weren't intended to be applied in such a formulaic way. They were designed to be responsive to the individual circumstances of the victim. But because of coercive control, we said, okay, women will be afraid, or they can be manipulated by the perpetrator of the violence to not pursue a complaint to police or not to pursue court action. So let's take the power away from the victim and give it to the police, so police can make an application without the consent of the victim. So perfectly logical response to coercive control. But if it's not coercive control, so where you've got a situation where you've got a woman who and a man who are in a park and they've been drinking together and a fight ensues and they're swinging punches at each other, hitting each other with thongs and stuff. This is seen on CCTV in certain parts of, in Sydney, I imagine, but certainly on the Esplanade in Cairns, for example, where a lot of Aboriginal people congregate and drink together, and occasionally some of them get in a fight. And then the police come because they see it on CCTV. No one's called the police. She's not afraid of him. He's not afraid of her. The police come, and if there's an order already in place, which is likely, not the first time this has happened, then they're breached with a protection order. So we've removed the discretion from police. And I'm very reluctant to say that we go back to, because we can't rely on police. I don't think. I think we and that's not a criticism of police. Don't get me wrong. Police have a specific role, and I think in general they do a very good job at doing that role. We've made many demands on them that in terms of increasing the response, improving the response. The same with courts. But now we've got so many, how would I put it? Like we're in a position where I think we need to empower victims again. And I don't think, at the time of the incident, support victims to make an informed decision about what is the right response in their circumstances. And I don't think that, we can expect police to be doing that. I think we need to be developing more a co-responder sort of response, so that we've got police, like experts who are able to give genuine information and support and enable victims of violence to be able to understand the context of their experience, what the potential risks are, what might be the right response for them, and support them to make an informed decision. It may be that they're still required, if there's grievous bodily harm, for example. Currently the situation is that the police can make, lay criminal assault charges, for example, or grievous bodily harm charges. So, that need not necessarily change. But I think in terms of protection orders, that they don't necessarily work for people, and sometimes they can have unintended detrimental consequences, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who are being roped into the criminal justice system through a protection order system that we designed to protect women from men's violence. But we're actually bringing women, and particularly Indigenous women, into the criminal justice system through those laws, because we haven't got a response that really is nuanced enough to accommodate coercive control and other scenarios that where women might, and men in some scenarios might be engaging in conflict or whatever. And look, I hesitate to say these things because I know it's complicated, and I don't want people to feel that I'm advocating that we go back to treating domestic or intimate partner violence as a fight. I'm not advocating that at all. And fights are serious, and fights are dangerous, and we need to be dealing with fights. But there is fundamentally there is a distinction, as Stark says, between coercive control and fights, and we need to be thinking about how do we best respond to that. And it's not always police and courts that are most effective response to that, and it has some negative outcomes for women as well. And my passion and my commitment and my work is about protecting women from coercive control. And I don't want the resources, the systems, the policy analysis that we've developed over time to be used against women who are not engaging in coercive control. So I don't know whether that's, I don't know if I had anything else to say, but they're the key points I wanted to make, I guess, and I'm very interested to hear disagreements and challenges and discussion and thoughts from people. Happy to answer any questions, as I'm sure Don is as well. You're going to come back and respond to any that...
So I'm in the lucky position of being able to ask the first question, but it's going to put you on the spot a bit. In New South Wales, as elsewhere, there's been increasing attention to the possibility of giving police the capacity to mount a prosecution without the victim's consent. Police have been concerned for years about victim withdrawing evidence and so on. And the most recent development of this is to bring domestic violence within what's called the Suspect Target Management Plan, which is basically a form of proactive policing where police make a real effort to, some would say harass, but certainly closely monitor anybody who's within the target suspect. So looking for any opportunity, breach of bail, breach of parole, any step out of line which might bring them back before the courts and get them locked up. What's your feeling about that? Is that going way too far, given the way in which the victim is kind of being sidelined from this process, or is that bringing relief to victims who would otherwise feel intimidated?
I think it goes back to the point about, whether if it's coercive control, if there's genuine coercive control going on, then I think there is a case for action without the consent of the victim, so not having to rely on the consent of the victim. But if a victim's saying, no, I don't want that action because it might actually put me at greater risk of violence, and there have been women who've been murdered after court action, after having an intervention order. I mean, the most recent in Queensland. whose partner was out on bail. I mean, that's another issue about whether or not he should have been on bail. But the fact, that kind of intervention can escalate violence against, where often, as in this case, he kills her and then kills himself. And that avoids the whole, from his perspective, that the only way out of this now is for us, for all of us, sometimes the children as well, to die. Women are, not always, but often, women know better than anybody else what the risks are to them. And if they've got an expert, well-trained support person, a co-responder, as I said, who can work with police and with the victim to figure out, what are the potential consequences of this action versus that action. That's what I think we need to be empowering victims to make that choice. Then we've got, because the other side of it is if we've got then these scenarios where we're constructing, in the case of the scenario I talked about in the Cairns Esplanade, which is one that I've written, a case study I've written up in research. They're both constructed as victims, so coercive, you can't have two victims of coercive control, because coercive control means one person's being subjugated and the other one's the subjugator, so they're mutually exclusive positions. But because we haven't focused on addressing coercive control as such, we then construct men and women as victims of intimate partner violence. And so, but in that case, the man had no choice. The police had to take action. The police said, well, she hit him, and that's prescribed act under the legislation, and they're in a relationship, so we must make an application for an order. And then because of the nature of that relationship and the violence, it happened many, many, many times, so breach after breach after breach. But no one's ever calling the police. She doesn't want the police involved, but he doesn't want the police involved. He doesn't need the state to come in and protect him from her, but he doesn't have a choice. So we need... if we had a co-respondent to talk to him about, well, how do you want to handle this case, he'd say, and then there needs to be some response. I mean, they're fighting and there needs to be some response, but whether it's in some cases, as I've argued, for some of the scenarios where people are at extreme disadvantage, mental health issues, extreme alcoholism, drug dependence, their lives are in absolute chaos, the legal system's not the answer to that. It's just going to have people cycling through the court system. That's what happens. But if we had a socio-medical response to those situations, and again, I don't want to go back to the 60s where it was all, any intimate partner violence is about she's crazy or, whatever. We don't want to go back there. But we also don't want to deny a more appropriate response to those scenarios. So I think we've just got to be very careful about it all being in one basket.
Okay, there must be questions. Anybody? Yeah.
There seems to be a lot of research.
Hang on, wait till you get that.
A lot of the research seems to be focused on the victim and the probability of her being a victim. I'm just wondering if there's been as much research on the perpetrator and actually responding to the risk factors for the perpetrators.
Yeah, so ANROS has recently announced a program of research on perpetrator interventions. There's been a lot of interest in Australia, as I'm sure you know. New South Wales has actually come late to the perpetrator intervention system. Queensland's had perpetrator intervention programs since about 1985, 7, something like that, so a long history of perpetrator intervention programs. Most of the programs in Australia have been based on the Duluth model, which is an integrated justice system response to perpetrators. In the sexual assault areas, it's the risk needs responsivity kind of model. So there's different models for different kinds of violence, but there's been an increase, and I think about 18 months or so ago, the New South Wales government announced $20 million for perpetrator intervention. So there's a lot of activity happening around that now, but we don't really have good evidence about what are the outcomes and what should we even measure as success with these perpetrator interventions. So we've recently funded some research after the announcement from the Council of Australian Governments of the National Standards for Perpetrator Interventions. So the idea of this program of research is to support the implementation of standards across Australia. So to trying to figure out more well, first of all, what should we be measuring as success? Is it only about recidivism, or are there other benefits of perpetrator interventions from the perspective of the perpetrator and the victim that are valuable things that we should be doing? And so we're wanting to understand that better. We're also wanting to understand better, how do we respond to immigrant and refugee men and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? Like even is the analysis that we've got about the causes and underlying context of intimate partner violence or violence against women, or domestic and family violence, whatever, for Aboriginal, have we got the kind of have we got the right kind of analysis of the underpinning causal factors? There's no one single cause. But if we're applying the Duluth model, for example, which is about, and the Duluth model relies on the power and control wheel, and so I can imagine having been, and some of you may also have been, to some of the remote Aboriginal communities where we see these extreme poverty, extreme disadvantage, extreme trauma playing out in the everyday lives of people. And I think about that power and control wheel and talking to them about male privilege, really. So I just think we have to better understand how we can engage with men effectively about the perpetration of violence, and the response again has to be tailored to the context. So there's some research coming, but it's in Australia in particular, the evidence base is very slim. But there's a couple of papers on the ANRO's website that was the current state of knowledge on perpetrator interventions in Australia, and a mapping of perpetrator pathways through the justice system in each of the Australian states of territory. So that's a piece of research that we've done in ANRO's as a foundation piece for these other projects to come.
Okay. I was, when you first put up the slide and started talking about emotional abuse, I was actually thinking of childhood emotional abuse as an indicator. And I just wondered if you had screened for that within the study that you did, to see if they had grown up in a household where there was coercive control. I just think it would be really interesting to have a study on the environment, because we know a lot of the neuroscience now, the trauma on the brain for a developing child, is that emotional abuse or coercive environment that they're living in, frightening environment, is that a marker for them being to later on experience physical or sexual assault, or to be a perpetrator?
Peter Cox, who again is cited in Effie and Suzanne and Don's paper, is a senior research officer at ANRO's, and she did two projects in our first set of research priorities. One was further analysis of the PSS, and another one was about the what did she call it? The co-occurrence of sexual violence. So this is not going directly to your question, but I think it's related to it. But it does show a correlation between experiences of childhood sexual abuse and emotional abuse and intimate partner violence. So there is something there, I think, suggesting that when women have experienced trauma and abuse, that they, and I guess it's about, or potentially about, identity and worthiness, and so they don't have high expectations of how they ought to be treated, then that may contribute to vulnerability.
Yeah, there's been research on childhood sexual assault, but not of children actually living in that frightening, coercive, controlling environment, and with no real significant attachment figure. Yeah. And what does that then do to their brain, but also to their personality, and then to how they are future as an adult? I think the research is mixed about whether or not children who are exposed to violence are more vulnerable to becoming victims and or perpetrators later in life. So.
There's a parallel literature, actually, Gerard Patterson, you might have heard of, his coercion theory, which is a theory, Patterson's theory is a theory really of general antisocial development among children. So his basic story is the child learns coercion is a primary means of dealing with conflict with others rather than negotiating, and has learned that from the way in which parents treated him. Now, the interesting thing about that is that those kinds of coercive family environments are hugely predictive of later involvement in general crime. And the interesting thing there is that there's a lot of overlap between men convicted of domestic violence and men convicted of lots of other crimes. So if you look, for example, at what offences people convicted of domestic violence do, the next offence is usually this amazing collection. It could be traffic offences. It's just a general tendency to breach rules. So, I mean, it may well be that those coercive environments generate a coercive response in lots of situations, not just those involving domestic violence and partners and friends and so on.
If I could expand on that point, I've got this thing.
All right,
So,
okay.
if I could just expand on that point too, and bring it back to the issue of automatic or, sort of lack of discretion for police or mandatory or pro-arrest policies and so on, thinking of defiance theory, because the Sherman sort of talks about why it is that some groups, so the whole pro-arrest stuff started in the US because of his work that showed a decrease where, with the pro-arrest policy, but further investigation showed that actually that worked for men with a stake in conformity. Yeah. But those who didn't, particularly black unemployed men, it escalated violence against them. Their partners were at greater risk of violence. And so when I think about that or apply that to the context here for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and the relationship between Aboriginal people in the state, when you have people who feel that the system's unfair, or you're being discriminated, or you take pride in being outside the system and the system that's making rules, then you're going to defy those rules. So this is another reason why I think we have to be careful about the way in which we deploy police and courts. It's not to say that we don't do it, but we have to be mindful of some of these unintended consequences or reactions that we might get that in fact escalate offending behaviour.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Good morning and thank you for your time. I was wondering, in terms of in the criminal justice system, there's deferral methods such as merit and drug courts for people involved in drug offences, obviously. Is there any system that provides a referral for domestic violence to a similar style of court, such as merit?
Well, there are specialised domestic violence courts in some jurisdictions in Australia, and most recently in Queensland. However, that's the court that put Bradford on bail, who then murdered his partner and killed himself. But there's lots of examples of where courts can refer, and in fact Queensland for some time had another jurisdiction I know have a process of referring men to perpetrator programs, and in some cases, and I was thinking about Queensland particularly because of their voluntary intervention order process, where what was happening in practice was that magistrates would would say to the perpetrator or the respondent to the application, you can undertake a voluntary intervention order, go off to the perpetrator program, and then come back, and so that they would have an interim protection order, but then if they'd completed the program, would go back to the court and the order wouldn't be confirmed, so then that would be the end of it. So there is that. That's relatively controversial, and again, we don't really have any data on whether that's an effective or appropriate thing to be doing, and if we are going to be doing that, how do we assess who's appropriate to go into that kind of program? How do we... I think we still have to do a lot of work on... I think we've done a lot of work, and I think we've done good work on risk assessment in general. I mean, we know what the high risks are for, strangulation, for example, is one of the highest risks, and Queensland's now... So if I talk a lot about Queensland, it's because that's where I've done most of my work, and I've still been involved in submissions and policy work around that, including being on the task force on... they call it the Bryce Report now, but anyway, the Premier's Special Task Force on Domestic Violence in Queensland, so I know a lot more about what's happened there than in other jurisdictions. But there's a lot of similarities across the jurisdictions anyway. I think everyone's sort of generally going in the same direction, but in slightly different ways. But the strangulation is now a discrete offence in the criminal code in Queensland because of the recognition of it as a high risk for homicide. Used to be called choking, but and there are injuries that can result in death several days after an attempted strangulation. So, we have got risk assessment tools. I think we've done some really good work on that, but I think we need to support victims to be able to make informed decisions about what's going to be the most effective response for them, rather than bringing in the state for a number of reasons, and probably more than I've got time to go into depth here today about.
Probably worth pointing out that if you look on the Campbell Collaboration website, which is where all the systematic reviews on what works is present, it's very dismal reading when you look at interventions, or at least court-based interventions for domestic violence. None of them come out with flying colours, so there's a hell of a lot of work to be done in that area.
So
anybody else?
That site?
So Campbell Collaboration. Just Google CAMPBLL website reviews or something like that. You'll get it.
Thank you.
Jenna's got a question.
Jenna.
Heather Douglas and Heather Nancarrow have both done great work around strangulation. Why is it only the...
Hang on a sec.
Sorry, I have to use microphone, so sorry.
So there's been great research on the incidence of non-fatal strangulation as an indicator of what's to come. But I think Queensland's the only state that's made it a discrete offence. How can we encourage other states and territories to do the same?
Well, I think it's probably just a matter of looking at what is happening in Queensland around the strangulation. I mean, if people are aware of it as, probably the biggest sort of red flag in terms of potential homicide, and in fact results in homicide, but, even the attempted strangulation itself, making it an offence, a separate offence in the criminal code, there are quite a few perpetrators of violence being convicted of that offence in Queensland. I've seen some stuff recently from colleagues that it's being applied weekly in Queensland. I mean, it is something. It's phenomenal that it is a very typical thing, particularly in coercive control, where it's look. I think the other thing about it, the criminal code. The assault charge, I mean, one of the reasons why we've got the civil law response is because we've always had assault laws, and theoretically, intimate partner violence could be dealt with under the criminal code through the assault laws, for physical violence at least. So that's one of the limitations, that it's limited to physical violence. But it was very difficult to prove beyond reasonable doubt the standard of proof for criminal law, the facts of a case when it was her word against his, and because a coercive controlling partner knows how to manipulate and also knows where to hit and all these sorts of things about. But anyway, the law, the assault laws were really constructed around male experiences of assaults, and so didn't really accommodate this. So this law is one. I think one of the benefits of this is it's a piece of law that actually is gender sensitive, but in favour of women. So whereas assault laws are gender sensitive but in favour of men and exclude women's experiences, so strangulation laws really speak directly to women's experiences of intimate partner violence in particular. So I think it's an important piece of legislation, and I think it's what the outcomes though for women, or what it means longer term, I'm not sure. But we know that there's a number of sort of frequent prosecutions under the strangulation laws.
But what about going to other states and territories? Anything happening there?
Not that I'm aware of, but
So Section 37
yeah. So it's changing, is it?
If we do have a particular offence for strangulation, but Queensland's different because it specifies domestic settings. So if you look at them, they are slightly different, and they have gone forward because of that, specifying that context.
Yeah. Hello and thanks, Jane.
Thanks. Any other questions? Yeah.
This one or the last one?
Okay.
I work with women and children who are victims of DV, and I work with women and children who are victims of domestic violence, and I hear over and again that it's better just to try and deal with it in-house than to go through the legal system, because the outcomes for women, they're not feeling very positive about what will happen, and that their children will be unsafe. So it's better to try and deal with it on their own, in their own way, and manage it themselves, So our role is to try and keep them and their children safe in that management of it when they don't want to take it, particularly to family law court. Did you find any of that as a reason why women wouldn't, did they say anything in your study?
Me or
Yeah, Don.
Heather?
Don.
No, we certainly haven't had the data that would allow us to look at that. You really need the sort of work that Heather does and has done to get a feel for that.
Yeah, I think that we should be supporting women to make informed choices, and we shouldn't ever be directing them to one or the other without exploring what their particular circumstances are and what from their assessment, with support to make that assessment of what the various options might be. I mean, it's a bit like in the sexual assault area too, women being advised don't go through the court because the chances are it's going to be negated and and you'll feel worse off. I mean, I think women, we should be respecting their right really to have as best as possible all the facts before them, consideration of what the consequences might be in partnership with her, figuring that out and supporting informed decisions. But I think there has been, the confidence in the legal system has increased and decreased, and I think it varies from one place to another, but also over time, the degree of confidence that women have in the legal system, whether it's family court or whether it's the criminal court or whether it's a protection order system, whether it's just in the civil court, and I know that some service providers will say, well, it'll depend on the magistrate that we get on the day, what the outcome will be. So, but I think that the increase in protection order applications, for example, across the country, is an indication of a degree of confidence in the system. But I also think it's an increase in an increasing definition of what the problem is that we, to return to the point that I was making earlier. It's also a reflection of the broader definition that we now have, or a greater number of people identifying, and particularly New South Wales, because you have protection order system ABOs aren't limited to particular relationships, but include neighbourhood disputes and so on. So.
We're all out of time. Would you join me in thanking Heather